is as a general introduction to philosophical issues. I'll be talking about historical figures, but mainly what I want to do is to introduce you to the issue. So if you look through the syllabus, you'll see that each week's topic, this one's introduction, but each week's topic will be some general area or issue within something called philosophy. Now, you've taken this philosophy course. You had other options. I mean, you could have taken other things. I don't think there's anybody, let me just make sure that that's right. Is there anybody in the room who, for some reason or another, is specifically required to take this particular course? As far as I know, your requirements are to take something or other, and there's about 4 selections. And so what guides your selection is sometimes what's available. Sometimes it's what's available at a particular time. But I hope that at least in some of your cases, you had sufficient choices that at least part of your decision was based on some degree of interest in the course. And that wouldn't be your fault if that weren't true. Sometimes it's just because the choices aren't there. But I hope that some of you had some thought that this might be a neat experience as these things go. But what I need to know now from you, and I can't know in advance, is, well, what did you think this experience would be? I mean, so the question is, what's philosophy as far as you know? I mean, the word does appear in normal English usage. It's not like some of the names of courses, that have such technical names that you'd never hear them in common language. Philosophy, that's a word that comes up. But what is it that you guess you're going to be getting here in taking this course? Yeah.
I thought philosophy is just like different points of view.
So philosophy is different points of view. And that's correct. I mean, as you'll see in the quarter, we'll certainly be exposed to lots of different people's points of view. But you get different points of view in other areas of inquiry. What makes anything philosophical? I mean, let's say somebody's a pretty philosophical person. What does that mean? Or let's say somebody refers to one's philosophy of life. What's that? Different points of view about life, I guess, for one thing. But let me offer you some options. If I can find the right implement here. General rubric of philosophy, we've got such things as the philosophy of life. But there's also such things as, you'll see this if you ever look in an RIT course book, philosophy of science. And there's political and social philosophy. And you get philosophy of religion. The traditional disciplines within philosophy have sometimes just those kinds of mysterious names that I was saying philosophy's not like, but sometimes even in course books, even at RIT, you'll see reference to a word, metaphysics. That's a philosophy course. Epistemology. Ethics. Well, another key one, I mean, this could go on and on and on. As a matter of fact, once I start writing philosophy of this and philosophy of that, I mean, there's just about no subject, no discipline, no area of inquiry at all that you couldn't put in there in the blank. Philosophy of physics, philosophy of psychology, philosophy of social sciences, philosophy of social work. That's a course that's offered here at RIT. Something's supposed to differentiate these particular, like a philosophy of physics course isn't going to be a course in physics. What might it be about? And how can this same word, I mean, I'm asking a philosophical question right here at the beginning. Well, how can this one word work in such various contexts? How can you have a philosophy of physics, philosophy of life? How can ethics be a philosophical discipline? How can logic be a philosophical discipline? Yeah.
Philosophy is thought.
Philosophy is thought. So if that were correct, then these courses teach thought about these different subjects, whereas within the different subjects, they don't think about them at all. Now that can't be quite right. So maybe sharpen it up.
Deeper thought.
All right, well maybe it's deeper, maybe it's not. But let me first of all hasten to add something that's important. Some people, and it's usually the people that teach in the philosophy department at university, some people have PhDs in philosophy, right? But other people, like the folks that teach in the chemistry department, have their PhDs in chemistry. And there are people with PhDs in psychology and PhDs in engineering. All these different subjects, people can get PhDs. Now, what does PhD stand for? Anyone know?
A doctorate.
It's a doctorate, but what does to say something incorrect? I was going to say in every single discipline, the most advanced degree you can get is the doctor of philosophy. That's not true in law, and that's not true in medicine. In law, you get an MD, not a PhD. I'm sorry, in medicine. In law, you get an LLD. But how can all these different disciplines, I mean, what can the meaning of the word philosophy be so that it can be extended to these cases? Any further suggestions? Way in the back. Theory. Theory is often important in philosophy, as is the critique of theory. But theory is important in physics as well. So we're still trying to sharpen it. We're right in the right ballpark here, but we're trying to sharpen down what a philosophical person might be. There, and then back to here.
Well, like, you're making a difference between, like, someone who's a PhD in philosophy or whatever. Well, you'd be based on fact in chemistry. It would be just opinionated.
Okay, so your suggestion is that in the particular sciences, say, like in chemistry, in the particular disciplines, their enterprise is based on fact, whereas in philosophy, in the discipline philosophy, the opinions of the practitioners are based on opinion only, and not on fact. Not on fact. Opinion as opposed to fact. And maybe that picks up on what in the back of the room was referred to as theory. I mean, maybe this word opinion is something like what you suggested. Well, that's not right either. And I've got something that I may repeat to you again, but I mean, you may be able to help me out on a particularly perplexing problem that I've got. You've all heard the expression, and I've repeated this in other countries and in other languages, and apparently the same expression has duplicate images in many, many different cultures and many, many different languages. But the expression I'm thinking of is this. It says, well, that's very good in theory, but it doesn't work at all in practice. I mean, you've heard that expression, right? Now, maybe you can help me understand how it is that something can be good in theory if it doesn't work in practice. I mean, it isn't really good in theory if it doesn't work in practice, is it? I mean, what theories are for is ultimately to guide practice. So if it doesn't work in practice, then you'd scrap that theory and you go back to the drawing board and find out some other theory that does. And opinions aren't particularly valuable if they conflict with the facts. But you may be onto something that is characteristic of philosophy in all of these different guises when you try to begin to point to some differentiation between theory and fact, between opinion and fact. You're not far from the mark, but what philosophers do and what people do when they're being philosophical isn't something that is supposed to be opposed to the facts or different from the facts. And before I make the further step, I did promise there's a couple of people who had some thoughts here. What was your thought?
Thought and discussion about the origin, the use, and the importance of the subject.
I'm sorry. Say it more slowly. I can't. Part of what I have to do is to try to repeat what you say because I don't know that the mics are going to get what your response is, and so I got to get
thought and discussion about the use, the origin, and the importance of the subject.
Okay, so all right. A philosophical discussion of physics, for example, would be a discussion about the use, the origin, and the importance of the subject, for example. Is that what you're saying? Very interesting suggestion. and it's included. It's in there. And did you have another? Okay. But let me just, instead of all this rhetoric and, asking you to tell me what I'm supposed to be saying, I mean, I've now figured it out thanks to you, but let me suggest to you that it's where facts are not so clear that things start getting philosophical. It's not that philosophers don't want facts. They'd love to have them. I mean, matter of fact, it seems to me the enterprise of philosophical thinking, whether it's done by a person called a philosopher or whether it's done by you in your day-to-day lives or whether it's done by physicists and chemists in their professions, wherever it's done, it seems to me, excuse me, that the philosophical enterprise is undertaken where questions are tricky, where questions aren't so clear, where facts are not readily available. Every philosopher wants his opinion, his theory, to be true to the facts. And indeed, a lot of philosophical effort, maybe more than 50% of it, the majority of philosophical undertaking is done not in the presentation of some positive theory, but in the criticism of somebody else's theory. And how does that criticism go? The criticism goes, that theory is not true to the facts, or is not reasonable to hold. So a lot of philosophical effort isn't just like construction work in trying to build some grand theory of something. A lot of it's demolition work, trying to show that somebody else's theory, or maybe my own previous theory, really doesn't work as well as I thought or they thought it did. So let me define philosophy first and foremost. I will pick a new piece of paper since I seem to have used that one up. Just for our purposes, and you'll find that people disagree about this. This is one of those philosophical questions where facts are hard to come by. But philosophy is the study, the examination of questions, issues that don't presently, I'm going to underline that, lend themselves clear-cut solution. It's the study of questions that don't presently lend themselves to clear-cut solutions. And I've underlined the word presently because the hope is precisely to give some clear-cut solution to a problem. Now, how does that, let's go back, there that is, and I'll put that thing back up there so you can look at it. But now that I've got that on the board, look here again. And remember that there's 3 dots down at the end. This is a never-ending list. I think I can zoom back. Let's get that whole thing in there. And I've just given you some examples of different issues that are treated in philosophy courses. But at the state of the art of every discipline, and I keep using physics as an example, in part because I'm very interested in the sciences and I teach a philosophy of science course, but at the very state of the art in physics, for example, the practitioners often will be in disagreement about some particular issue. Sometimes it's a theoretical issue. For 30 years and more, the last 30 years of Einstein's life anyway, Einstein was in a huge dispute, theoretical dispute, with Niels Bohr about the nature of quantum mechanics, which is one of the most exciting and advanced areas of modern physics. But they were talking about exactly how one was supposed to interpret quantum mechanics. And they had huge differences on the subject, which I won't go into now. They thought of those differences, and they were right, they thought of those differences as philosophical differences. Because the facts weren't there. I mean, if the facts were there that could make it very clear which of them was right, they wouldn't have had that argument. They would have said, okay. They would have gone to the experimental data, used the experimental data, and if there were no further room for philosophical disagreement, they would have resolved that dispute. But as long as the experimental data was not there that could sufficiently clear up the question, it continued to be a philosophical question. And interestingly enough, partially because they're from Europe, where the division among the disciplines is not such a big deal, they, all their lives, as far as I know, both of them thought of themselves as natural philosophers. And that's the old word that was used before physicist. I mean, physicist is a word that's coined in English. It has comparable values in other languages. And it is a modern phenomenon that any of the disciplines are distinct. I mean, all the disciplines used to just be the pursuit of wisdom in a particular area. Everybody used to be a philosopher. Does the name Adam Smith ring a bell? Who's Adam Smith? It just rings a bell. Does anyone know who Adam Smith is? In what field does Adam Smith make a contribution? Economics. He's often thought of being the father of modern economic theory. Economics as a discipline didn't really differentiate itself from philosophy until late. But when Adam Smith was working, he was officially the chair of moral philosophy at the University of Edinburgh, I believe, in Scotland. And when Isaac Newton did his work, who's Isaac Newton? You got to know everything. Physics, right? So when Isaac Newton did his work, and he's one of the founders of modern physics in the 17th century, when he did his work, he was the chair of natural philosophy at, I believe, Cambridge. Now, where they were chairs of this and that is not so important. What I'm trying to emphasize is they made their groundbreaking contributions to their disciplines as far as they were concerned, philosophers. What made those things groundbreaking contributions? Well, it's just this. Questions that before their time had been like this were, because of their work, made a little bit more clear-cut. You can think of the study of motion, for example, as a good example. Galileo is the person who, using geometric methods, came up with, later became the equations of motion that Newton used in his groundbreaking work. But before Galileo figured out, for example, that the most effective way to understand motion was in terms of how much distance is covered per unit time, before he figured out that would be a very, very useful way to look at motion, there were all kinds of other philosophical views of how one should regard motion. Aristotle, for example, a person you're going to read next week, who was a student of Plato's, Aristotle thought that motion was best understood as things moving toward their natural place. So that, for example, this pen, when I drop it, has made great progress toward its natural place. Now, it did get stopped here by the surface of the floor. But if I were to remove that, well, the pen would be able to make further progress toward its natural place. And all motions should be understood in this way. We'll cover the pen. Now, that was one theory. It was the dominant theory for 1,000 years and more. 1,500 years. But there were other philosophical theories of motion. When someone, Galileo in particular, came up with a way of portraying motion that then lent itself to a clearer presentation of what people were trying to get at in studying motion, then more and more people adopted that way of looking at things, and the study of motion became less and less, at least for those people, less and less a philosophical problem, more a clear-cut problem which now could accept practitioners who would just study that thing and learn all the right ways of doing it. They wouldn't have to debate from the ground floor every 20 seconds, just exactly what's the right way of studying motion. They could all say Galileo's way is it and master it, right? And then that allows progress to be made. Once people have figured out what the right approach to a problem is, or what the clearest approach to a problem is, then they are in a good position to begin to make some more progress. They don't have to debate the foundations of the discipline over and over again. So philosophy, wherever you look at it, is the examination, the study of questions that don't lend themselves to to clear answers. So whether you're at the state of the art in some very advanced discipline, like one of the sciences, or whether we're talking about the philosophy of life, how ought one to live one's life? The common feature in those two kinds of questions is that there's no real clear-cut answers. I mean, there's no rock you can turn over and find that the answer's under there. There's no experiment that you can do that can give you a decisive answer to the question. Or if you're asking ethical questions, what should a person do in a situation like that? Ethical questions are philosophical questions just because those questions don't lend themselves to clear-cut answers. You might like them to. We might like to have lists of rules. Just give me the list of rules, I'll follow them, and then I'll be ethically okay. But you know, lists of rules never work. Situations just are too complex for that. You always have to ask yourself, is this the right thing to do? This rule conflicts with that rule. How am I supposed to make a decision between these two damn rules? So any area where the answers aren't clear-cut, that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's the best definition of philosophical that you're ever going to come by. And one upshot of that is this, that people with PhDs in philosophy in particular aren't thereby really the experts in philosophy. It'll depend on the question. It'll depend on the area, who the best people to ask would be for any philosophical question. How they should live their lives are themselves probably in as good a position as anyone to uncover the answers to those questions. They don't need to turn to professional philosophers. In the same way for ethical questions, just because philosophers teach ethics courses doesn't mean that they're any better at resolving ethical questions in their lives than anyone else is. It's just maybe they've studied ethical theories more. And they've studied perhaps how complicated it can be to bring ethical theories into practice. Those are the sorts of things that a professional in ethics might have a handle on. And I'd have to say, although I no longer am in a position to make the strongest case for this, since I'm an atheist, but I'd have to say that in areas of philosophy of religion, people who are professionals in religion, whether they're philosophers of religion or theologians, now this is my view on a tricky philosophical question, but it seems to me that they're not necessarily the best people to turn to either. I mean, these seem to me to be the same sorts of questions as these other ones are. There is no way to find a clear-cut solution to the problems, and so one has to rely on what sources as one can find to decide what one is going to believe. All right, any questions about that? Because so far all I've wanted to do is to define philosophy. And one important consequence that I haven't written down, I'm not going to write down, but I want you to remember this. One important consequence is that who the experts are on philosophical questions, that's something that's going to vary from question to question. And in lots of areas, the answer might be, there's no experts on that question. The best example I can think of is, how should one live one's life? I mean, who is the expert on that? What is the right relationship between the individual and society? How much should one's own, these are all philosophical questions, how much should one's own desires, interests, predilections define one's life? To what extent, on the other hand, should one take into consideration the needs and desires and interests of others? And then which others? I mean, how broad a base of others do we have to take into consideration in figuring out how to define our lives? These are all philosophical questions, and I'd say that they're pretty close to the how should one live one's life kind of question. I don't know who's going to be an expert on these. There's lots of people who have great ideas on the subject, lots of different opinions. But I don't see anybody that I would sort of pinpoint as being an expert on the subject. But in areas of physics, there are tricky questions, and there's some people whose answers I would respect and other people's answers I wouldn't have so much respect for because they haven't really studied the subject. So there may be experts in some philosophical areas, and there may not be experts in some others, and where those experts are will vary from question to question. All right, so that's issue number one. And what that also suggests is, and I will do this up here too now, that if I had to, this isn't an exhaustive list either. I'll put an arrow to the left and to the right of this graphic to indicate that I don't mean this to list everything in the area. Just these are 3 examples. These are 3 disciplines that are sometimes thought to be quite distinct. I mean, maybe especially religion and science. These are supposed to be very, very distinct disciplines. But I suggest to you that all 3 of these things, and I put these arrows on the right and the left to indicate that there might be lots of other things that you could put on this list, but all 3 of these things are originally motivated in human affairs by attempts to grapple with tough questions. Sometimes, I put them in this arrangement. This is supposed to indicate no particular order here, philosophy, religion, science. Sometimes you'll get people saying, well, religion comes first. That's really the old way of trying to solve tricky human problems about what's the nature of the world, what's the nature of the human condition. People will say, all right, religion came first, then along comes philosophy, thousands of years later, and then in the modern world we've got science. Well, I don't think that makes any sense, really. I mean, but you'll see some people portraying the situation in that kind of chronological order. I don't think that's correct. I think all 3 of these areas, and as I say, there may be many others, all 3 of these areas, all of them are perennial attempts that go back, all 3 of them, as far as you have written evidence, and I think will continue on into the indefinite future. All 3 of them involve efforts on the part of people to grapple with tough questions. They often offer different strategies for doing that. Different strategies for grappling with questions, but all 3 are motivated by the same basic desire, is to try and figure out the answers to those things. Some questions lend themselves to scientific treatment, some questions don't. Same with the other disciplines. I think there's no reason even to divide them and separate them out in that way. I mentioned to you already that I myself am an atheist. This is going to become important because we're going to talk about philosophy of religion in a couple of weeks, from time to time. But I don't think that that's a necessary truth. As far as I know, for example, lots of people who are very religious find scientific confirmations for their religious beliefs. And there are many people at the very cutting edge of the sciences who are extremely religious. Particular religious doctrines may part from, conflict with particular scientific doctrines, but there's no need for a conflict between science and religion. And there's certainly no need for a conflict in any of these 3 areas. One may take as one's motivation for trying to understand the universe as closely and as precisely as one can one's own awe of nature. I mean, one's desire to figure out what God's handiwork really is. I mean, that might be one's motive for studying science. So there's no need for these things to conflict. Where the dividing lines are is not so clear. As I've said, at the cutting edge of science, and I think at even the basis of religion, are deep philosophical questions. So when I write things like this, the second point in this first introductory discussion, the second point is that I don't really know that those things can be divided in any clear-cut way. I mean, philosophical issues, I mean, this much is clear. Philosophical issues, I've said, are ones that are not quite so clear-cut as other issues. So within science, for example, there will be lots of issues that are clear-cut, like what's the value of this variable? What's the equation for that? But if there are other questions that are more philosophical, like sometimes sometimes it comes to the attention of physicists that equations that they've been using for years may not be the very most accurate and best ones. So they have to go out and look for alternatives And different people might have different ideas for a long time. There might be arguments among scientists. Well, I like this procedure. No, I like this procedure. And those would be philosophical differences. So within science, you'll find both questions that are clear-cut and questions that are not so clear-cut. But generally, what I'm trying to say in this second point is that these are not necessarily in conflict. Philosophy, religion, science. There will be some points of difference in procedure. There will be some points of difference in the mode of training in the several areas, but there will also be perhaps some commonalities. All of them, I think, derive from a single human motivation, and that's to try to understand things. Try to understand things in the world, try to understand things about themselves, try to understand their relationships with other people, and it's these efforts to understand that lead to these undertakings, which get these fancy names later on. Questions, comments, anything that I've... Yes?
Sort of along the line of them not being separate, I noticed a lot in the reading, Plato mixed philosophy with religion. He was constantly bringing up the fact of...
A god.
Yes, the different gods, how they feel about different things that people were doing.
Yeah. That's almost... I mean, I was about to say that's almost inevitable. One way of understanding the whole idea of God is just as the ultimate answer, the ultimate explanation. I think at least this much can be said, that for those who believe in God, there is something of that role that God plays. I mean, I should tell you the other story. I don't speak out of complete ignorance about this. I used to be a Baptist youth fellowship leader some millions of years ago. No longer am. They don't want atheists being Baptist youth fellowship leaders. But I mean, when I was in my teens anyway, there's evidence. I don't know what. I've forgotten how old I was, but somewhere in my teens, still early teens probably, I wrote an essay in which it's obvious, if you read this thing, it's obvious that I take the idea, the one I now have, the idea that there's no God, that idea to me back then was just so ludicrous. It made no sense at all. Now, interestingly, I can't quite place myself in that person anymore, but I do remember lots of things about belief. And belief in God, among other things, has this aspect. I don't know how central it is, but it seemed to me, in my case anyway, to have had this aspect, that it helped provide answers. It helped you place yourself in the world. It made sense of things. In looking at different religions in other cultures, I think you can see that very clearly, that in those other cultures, those other religions, there's lots of things where you might not attribute a divine intervention. But you can see what they're up to. Often it's where they don't understand, where something lacks a clear-cut answer. They often will say, well, that's one of the aspects of divinity. In trying to handle diverse arrays of just complex and confusing facts, sometimes the idea of a God will serve to bind everything all together. But that's also what theories do, isn't it? That's what theories are supposed to do. When we have a bunch of complex facts, sometimes a scientific theory or a philosophical theory will be brought forward in a hope to bring these things together, to show you how these things relate. For example, in the Newtonian move from earlier physics, we had Galileo. I've mentioned Galileo as having figured out what the laws of motion were for objects like that. flying around on the surface of the Earth, what the laws of motion were for projectiles fired out of cannons, for masses dropped off the Leaning Tower of Pisa, for things set in motion down inclined planes. Galileo figured out accurate laws of motion that, at least within the limits that were of importance to them, were determined. For example, what the future position of an object would be if it starts out here, if it's let go with this initial velocity, and it's under these forces. He was able to compute that. Johannes Kepler, on the other hand, was able to figure out what the real laws of motion were of the planets as they orbited the sun. Not moving objects on the Earth, but the planetary objects. And one of Newton's great contributions was to show that he could cast the laws of motion in such a way that both these very different areas of motion could come under the same theory. And then to just put a loop on this connection between references to God and references to science, Newtonian physics then, for the next couple hundred years, became, I don't know that anyone actually used this expression, but it came to be understood by lots of the physicists who were studying it as an examination of how God's laws worked. God had been, the author of the motions of the planets. God is the author of the forces in the universe. That's a long-standing idea. Now we're beginning to figure out what the different laws of motion are. But that doesn't undermine the idea that God's in charge. That just says, these are the laws that God set up. This is how God does it. That's cool. This is how God's clockwork works. And the whole universe was understood by Newtonians up until the beginning of the century anyway. It was understood the whole universe was a giant clockwork, and God was the designer. We'll return to that theme later on in part of our study of the philosophy of religion. But all of this is mixed up together. And what I want to leave you with is just to remind you, this isn't just an historical anomaly. This isn't just an historical fact about what people used to think. To this day, as people study the origins of the universe according to contemporary theory, the best modern theories, the most well-supported modern theories, are ones that refer to a Big Bang. Indeed, a Big Bang and then a constantly expanding universe. There's all kinds of alternative theories that have kind of fallen by the wayside right now. So contemporary physicists figure there was a Big Bang, there was a singularity, and that's a very complex fact too, but there was a Big Bang and the entire universe, all of matter energy, and in addition, this is what's really weird and complicated, all of space and time were created by that Big Bang. But that doesn't stop people from asking the question, well, why the Big Bang? And for some, that's a religious question. So, it's not, modern progress in science, even modern evolutionary theory, has not stopped people, even people who believe in these modern theories, has not stopped them from continuing to ask the religious question. And so the parallel that you find in even modern writers in physics, Albert Einstein among them, God does not play dice, was one of Einstein's favorite remarks in his argument with Niels Bohr about the nature of quantum mechanics. And that what that symbolized for him was that we cannot be left with a physics that's indeterminate, as quantum mechanics seems to leave physics. Now, again, I don't mean to try to teach you quantum mechanics here in this course, but the arguments to this day among state-of-the-art scientists are sometimes couched at least in this religious vocabulary, and it means something to them. They're not just joking around. The universe, what Einstein can best be understood as saying, the universe just wouldn't make sense if this was all that could be said about it. Bohr. And the universe, of course, must make sense. God doesn't throw dice. It makes sense to describe those differences as philosophical differences, just because the questions aren't easy to resolve. But it doesn't have to be done way up there. It's, in people's normal lives, we have to try and figure out the answers to questions that aren't easy to resolve. Ethical questions, just questions about what's best for us, which you might or might not think of as ethical questions. Just trying to figure out what's in my best interest. That's not a question that, you can't turn over a rock someplace and find out the answer to that. Now, this may be a little bit of an exaggeration, but I think given the character, given the nature of the human being, we're just set up so that we can't avoid these kinds of questions that I'm talking about as philosophical questions. I mean, we're not, wired in nearly the kind of automatic way that many other animal species are. We've got to gather information, consider all kinds of consequences, and make decisions about what to do rationally. That's the word that's used. We use reason. And we have to make estimates of what's the best course of action in the light of incomplete information. I've sometimes said that people need to do philosophy. If you understand this particular interpretation of what philosophy is. People need to do philosophy as much as they need to breathe. Again, that's a little bit of an exaggeration perhaps, but what I mean by that is, given the kind of creature we are, we can't just rely on hard wiring, and we certainly can't rely on just what other people tell us, because they tell us different things. And we can't rely on books, because the books tell us different things. Somewhere along the line, we've got to make decisions. And we've got to make decisions in light of incomplete evidence. And those are just the kinds of problems that I've been calling philosophical, especially when there are things like, well, how should I interpret the way this person is acting toward me? What's in my best interest? What's the right thing to do in this situation? All those questions qualify under my very broad definition as philosophical questions. Now, these sorts of questions arise automatically for every individual and within every society and can be found in the history of every culture. We're stressing these Western figures, the Texas classics of Western philosophy, and that is a little bit parochial. That is, it's a little bit too limited. It would be nice if we could really examine in good comparative detail philosophies from all over the world, from all eras. But you see the thickness of this book. The thickness of that book, would be quite astonishing. I'm sure that it's possible to teach in 10 weeks a decent course in world philosophy, but I think that would necessarily have to be a bit more historically directed than I want to be. What I want to do today, though, is at least place in context for you the works that you're reading, the stuff by Plato, the Republic. I'm sorry, you're not reading the Republic, but you're reading the Apology and the Credo. I want to kind of place them in context. They were written at a time that's sometimes thought of as the birth of Western culture in classical Greece. The works of Plato are often thought to be some of the first works in philosophy. Plato is thought of as the father of Western philosophy. A lot of this stuff has a good deal of hype to it. My guess is that people have been doing philosophy much, much longer than is documented in a book that begins with Plato. But the fact about Plato is that he's the first person for whom we have a large and extensive library. He wrote lots of things which have survived. We still have his work. People who wrote before him we know something about them. I'm going to talk about a few of them today. We know a little bit about them, but their work has not survived, at least not in large chunks. We've got fragments of their work, a paragraph here, maybe even a page there, a line over here. We've got little bits and pieces. We have to interpret what it was that they've said. We know from some commenters like Aristotle, who's a student of Plato's. Aristotle actually wrote a good deal about what some of these earlier people thought, and so that gives us some clues about what they're like. But Plato had at least one important part of his value in the history of Western thought. It's just that his work survived. And even before the Greeks, even before the stuff that we have written down, it stands to reason that people were doing philosophy, at least if you understand it in this broad way that I've characterized it. People have been doing philosophy as long as there have been people. So I don't want to make too much of the idea that this is the beginning of Western philosophy. But it's the place we can start because we know a little bit about it. Our ignorance pretty much obscures stuff much earlier than this. The things that were philosophical topics back then, as you can imagine, were in much larger numbers. I shouldn't say that the numbers were larger, but some things that we regard as having achieved clear-cut solution had not, at that time, had any kind of clear-cut analysis. To give you an idea, some of the earliest people we know of